Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It looks like the rush has slowed down, so and as we are running a few minutes behind, I'm going to get us kicked off. So thank you very much for being here this afternoon, and welcome to this session, which, as you can see, is entitled "Unfinished Business: How good are our estimates of non-market output in the national accounts?" For those of you who don't know me, my name's Philip Wales. I'm the Chief Executive of the Northern Irish Statistics and Research Agency. But for today, the thing that's more relevant is that until quite recently, I was responsible for the measures of non-market output, both the government services and the broader non-market output measures that go into ONS's and the UK's national accounts. You might think, therefore, that I've got a kind of conflict of interest and a vested interest. Clearly, I think all these measures are brilliant because I was responsible for producing them. But as this audience will know, non-market output is a large and diverse sector, covering lots of, in particular, the government services that are the focus really of today's session, thinking about how we measure healthcare and education, criminal justice, and defence, and so on. They're measured, as lots of people will know, by different methods to that we measure the output of the private sector. And those methods have been the subject of long debates in academic circles, within NSIs, and, as we'll hear today, international statistical organizations as well. I think the experience of the pandemic, in particular, over the last few years, that's responsible for the grey hairs that I have, at least in part, has highlighted that the measurement of these industries, of these sectors, is yet to be really finally concluded and settled. There is more to say here about comparability across countries, about how we trade off perhaps conceptual purity with pragmatic and practical issues to do with data and data uses. And it's in that end that we've got a great panel here today for excellent speakers to cover off some of these issues. I'm going to come to them in a moment. We'll have 5 minutes each for kind of opening statements. We have rigged this slightly to have them focus on their areas of specialisms, but I'm hoping that with 5 minutes apiece, we'll have plenty of time for questions from the audience and across the panel afterwards. So to my left, I have Paul Schreyer. We'll start with you, Paul. Paul's the Chief Statistician at the OECD, and we've asked him to think in particular about the cross-country comparability piece for measures of non-market output. Coming next to Richard Hayes, Deputy Director at ONS. We've asked him to talk about what the UK measurement model is for non-market output. To his left, Martin Wheel, Professor of Economics here at King's and ESCO. We've asked him to think in particular about how, if at all, we will trade off things like international comparability and conceptual purity, particularly thinking about the role he has to play on the National Statisticians Committee for Advice on Standards for Economic Statistics. And then finally, last but not least, Helen Simpson, Professor of Economics from the University of Bristol. And we'll come to her to talk about productivity and the kind of public service productivity dimensions that arise from this area of work. With that, by way of introduction, I'll pass to Paul. Your 5 minutes start now.
Well, thank you, Philip, and good afternoon. This is a really important area, and I'm happy to say a few words from the OECD perspective. I'll start out with a little general remark. The session is labeled around non-market output. I do think that indeed non-market production poses specific issues around economic measurement, but I would actually go further and say there are many market producers where we have exactly the same issues. A private hospital and a public hospital, if we as statisticians want to measure the quality of the output, we are facing exactly the same issues. So I think this market, non-market is actually a blurred distinction. We should almost do away with it and think about measuring health services, education services, or general government, because when it comes to volume measurement, we are facing similar issues. In terms of terminology, I think it's also important that we distinguish between inputs, outputs, that what we want to measure for in the national accounts, and then outcomes is what we observe as a final state of affairs. The things are linked, of course, conceptually and otherwise, but just in terms of clarity. What can I say about international comparability in those 3 minutes that I've left. It is a big issue. Much of it turns around whether these services, in particular non-market service, but others as well, are measured from the input side. The volume measures, do they come from the input side? Do we count for nurses and teachers, or do we count for hospital operations completed and teaching services completed? There are some differences between countries, but again, it is very hard to make a general statement. You immediately have to drill down into the particular service provided. If you want to be super general and at the danger of overgeneralizing, I think it's fair to say that when we look at what is called collective services, that is general administration, defense, and so on, pretty much all countries use input-based methods. Okay, so look at the inputs that are being used, and even conceptually, there are some reasons why it can be quite useful to do that. When we look at individual services, so in particular health, education, probably housing, and to some extent, the picture becomes more mixed. And again, you have to drill down education or health. And within health, you have to ask, are we talking about hospital services? There's a lot of progress being made on measuring outputs for hospital services. It's much more complicated for nursing services, okay? Because what counts for nursing output is the time that nurses use to deal with people. Well, those are inputs. So, conceptually, it's not that obvious. And finally, of course, it is very important to look at what individual countries do by way of explicit quality adjustment. And I mean, that is another conversation about how much of an implicit, explicit quality adjustment we attach to these measures. But this is, of course, where we can see some difference, in particular the UK vis-a-vis a number of other countries. But I think I'll leave it here and let Richard talk a bit more, especially about the UK.
Thank you. So I'm going to very much take our to mean the ONS, and I'm going to take national accounts to mean the UK national accounts. Otherwise, I'm going to range onto territories that are not my specialist subject. And I'm going to probably give an answer which is, how good are they? They're pretty good. They could be better, or they could be very different, depending on how we think about the problems which we're facing in this area. So a very potted history of this subject is that the issue of non-market output has been a vexed one in British circles for at least 20 years. And Tony Atkinson's report in the early 2000s was a seminal point where we began to look and be given better guidance and principles to think about the different ways of potential ways of measuring, either inputs equals outputs, measures of output, or indeed measures of quality adjusted output, thinking about outcomes which drive that quality picture. And if we were to stand back and look at the rest of the national accounts, where we've got alternative metrics or methods, essentially the logic is that they should come back and give you the same answer. So whether you're looking at the cost of production of a good or service, or the flow of discounted benefits in the future from that good or service, the logic is, in a market structure, these should equilibrate. They should give you broadly the same answer. We know there's lots of reasons why they wouldn't. But it's very easy to imagine a world where, let's, for example, imagine we hold the inputs into a health service constant, but we double the number of operations or practices or examples of treatment which are happening. Now, if we were taking the inputs equals outputs world, holding it constant means that nothing has changed. There's been no productivity growth, there's been no output growth. If we look at the output measure of doubling the number of operations, we have plus 100%. But if this was an example where that caused an increased rate of mortality, such that people were unwilling to take this service anymore, because there's no price, we can't observe this. But if this was a market good, the price would fall to zero. This would be a good with no demand. So suddenly we've got a position where our free measurement methods either give you no change, plus 100%, or minus 100%. That's not a feasible range. And therefore, the push to standardise and get more output measures, at least, and to think about the potential to stretch on to quality-adjusted metrics is really, really important. Because if we were to try and think about this in a way equivalent to the rest of the national accounts, of including that quality adjustment, the factor that you would see in the price movement in a market good, you do need to capture that quality perspective. So where we predominantly within the UK use output measures in line with European system of national accounts, that's good, but if we included those quality adjustments, we could do better. And we have a depth of experience having produced those for far longer than I've been at the ONS, which is now getting on to be a dangerously long period of time. We have the track record of producing these quality adjustments for around 60% of public services. Going back to the mid-1990s for many of these services, covering particularly the big ones, health, education, social care, public order and safety. And importantly, they don't send a standardised, simple story. Health and education generally, excluding COVID, which was definitely a special event, have generally caused our picture of public service productivity to improve. At various points, public order and safety has particularly acted as a drag, and actually the quality detriment over the last few years has been quite visible. And adult social care, for example, we've seen quite a material change, which has pretty much cancelled out a fall in quantity. So whilst we have fewer interventions, the quality has improved and overall the outputs remain kind of constant. So we've done well, we could do better, but we could also think about this very, very differently because we think about public services very much in a world of health, education, justice being recurrent spending. But if you think about health and education, if, for example, you were taking a view of looking at human capital, these are investment. If you were thinking about human capital as a proper capital, you'd be thinking about these as investment with a rate of return on your investment into this capital asset. And it's worth thinking, colleagues of mine will be presenting data on our inclusive estimates of capital stock later in the conference. And so if one looks at the national accounts capitals that we currently capture, in the latest year they stand about 11 trillion. If one looks at natural capital, it stands about 1.7 trillion. If you look at human capital, it's at about 24 trillion. And as one of the academics here, I'm not going to call them out, recently said to me, if you're trying to understand the UK economy without taking account of human capital, it's like trying to understand the Himalayas without taking account of the mountains. It's so fundamental. It's not something we put into national accounts, but it is something that as an investment process, we could think about that as an alternative way of trying to capture a monetized metric, a rate of return on this investment, which gets us more into a national accounts concept. Because of course, if one's trying to take account of quality, you run up into all those quality methodological questions of, is 1% more quality equal to 1% more quantity? And you have to make assumptions in that space. I will pause there.
Well, thank you very much. If I could follow on, perhaps I'd begin by saying that only to what I assume to be a small number of people in the audience, those of you who haven't yet read the NS case minutes of our meeting on the 17th of April, which were posted on the ONS website at about 5 p.m. yesterday evening. Those of you who haven't yet read those won't know that the National Statisticians Committee to Advise on Standards for Economic Statistics recommended in principle that in the national accounts the ONS should make quality adjustments when producing the volume measures. And this, of course, follows from the argument that Tony Atkinson made for this. It's entirely consistent with the system of national accounts, but it's at odds with the European system of accounts that European Union membership had obliged Britain to follow. We are, of course, no longer bound by those, or at least we're partly bound by them, but my understanding is that the production of volume measures isn't bound by them anymore, whereas the production of value measures is, because there are some residual liabilities that follow on from those. Anyway, so how did NS Case reach its decision? NS Case follows multiple criteria, some of them which conflict with others. So what we want to know is whether the approach adopted gets to the heart of the matter. We certainly felt that taking account of quality adjustment got one closer to the heart of the matter than does not taking account of quality adjustment. Other issues we look at are whether there are going to be any difficult borderline issues. I don't think that arises in this case. Then we have the question, what about comparability over time? Well, of course, that matters. I think these changes to the national accounts can be taken back to 1997. And of course, if we never wanted to make any changes to the national accounts because of comparability over time, we'd still be producing them as they were in 1941. And I don't think anyone has been suggesting that. Then there's the issue of international comparability. And as Paul said, the UK is rather in the front line here, but the committee takes the view that, no, consistent with the ONS aspiration to be a leader and not always a follower, there are some circumstances in which one has to run ahead of international norms, and we felt the fact that there might be some loss of comparability with neighbouring countries. Well, there would be if ESA maintains its existing position. We felt that if that were the case, that was something that didn't offset the advantages. So, equally what I would say is that although, of course, during the epidemic we saw very different movements in productivity figures between countries that based their public sector output figures on outputs rather than inputs, I don't think the further adjustment for quality change would have a major impact of that, although there probably were no difficulties in producing the quality adjustments during the epidemic. Those are issues that the ONS, if the ONS decides to implement NS Case's proposal, and it is just a recommendation to the national statistician, if the ONS decides to implement them, then it will have to decide how to handle the period of the epidemic. If I could perhaps wind up with something that is a bit of a nagging doubt I have about this. Have we got the attribution correct? No. Medical treatment, tipping statins down people's throats has been probably quite an important influence in improving lifespan and therefore improving the quality of the medical treatment. But should we be treating that as an output of the non-market health service, or should we be treating that as an output of the pharmaceutical industry? In other words, has the gross output of the health service improved because of a change in the quality of the drugs available rather than a change in the treatment? I think, one doesn't want the best to be the enemy of the good, but that is an issue that people perhaps will have to think about as this approach beds down. But of course, in terms of measuring implications for final demand, if you get the intermediate inputs wrong, they will net out, except insofar as they're imported. So to the extent that we're using locally produced goods, I don't think that would affect the overall macroeconomic picture, and more generally, there would be an improvement in, or the committee felt there would be an improvement in the economic meaning of the statistics that are produced. My understanding is that the earliest this change could happen is 2026, so don't expect it tomorrow. And of course, whether the headline will be Brexit allows faster growth for the British economy because these productivity improvements are now being included in the measure of output, and if on balance they are improvements, or whether the headline will be 20 years ago GDP was even lower than we'd thought, because we know where it is now and the growth rate has been faster. Well, perhaps it'll depend which newspaper or which news source you tend to use. But anyway, the committee was firmly in favour of the idea of making this change, and I very much hope that the National Statistician follows our advice on the matter. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'd just like to broaden out a little bit to discuss why we might want to use the measures of the volume of output or outcomes delivered by the public sector in productivity measures. And I guess, first of all, just to think about, would we even necessarily be concerned in this circumstance if we saw a fall in productivity? So public services are quite different to private sector services. They have equity objectives as well as sort of efficiency of delivery objectives. And if it was the case that some health or education services started to reach more people, particular harder to reach groups, harder to treat groups, we might actually find a decrease in productivity acceptable at the expense of increased access and increased use. But why might we want to measure productivity? Well, it can be a useful sort of comparative tool to identify areas of concern. So if we do have good cross-country comparator measures, then we can think about how the UK is performing relative to, for example, other European economies. In the context of the levelling up agenda, I think the provision of public services across regions of the UK is going to be playing an incredibly important role as to whether individuals' lives are actually improved through levelling up initiatives. So being able to measure the delivery, access of public services and the performance of those public services across regions, I think, is going to be very important. And at a very much more micro level, we would like to know, can we use different productivity measures to identify potentially underperforming organisations within a sector? It's exactly what we do with the private sector. We get concerned about tails of underperforming organisations, but perhaps this can also be useful to identify areas of concern within the public sector. So having identified dispersion in productivity, what might we want to use that for? We might want to use it to understand what affects productivity in this sector, exactly the same as we might do in the private sector. And some of the exact same questions will apply. So how might developments in technology, IT, automation, the last session in this auditorium was about things like AI and how that might replace certain medical professionals, for example. So how might those technological developments affect productivity? Martin just spoke about the COVID pandemic affecting our measures of outputs, and certainly if we're going to use things like GCSE and A-level grades to measure quality over this period, we're going to have to be quite careful about what we're actually measuring. COVID also changed the inputs into these public services. So education moved to online learning. My GP, I haven't seen my GP in person for about 5 years. I can barely get a telephone consultation, but move to telephone consultations, online consultations, these things are changing how these services are delivered. Again, in parallel with the private sector, what would we do? We'd start to want to think about what is the production function for a public sector organisation, like a hospital, like a school. And I think what's special here, and what Paul said right at the beginning, is we shouldn't be thinking public-private. We should be thinking about what type of service is this that's being delivered. And again, what's special about things like health and education is that we, us ourselves, are the inputs into this, and individuals enter the production function in a way as an input. And how do we account for that? And I think that's important, partly because I'm much more of a microeconomist, so I disaggregate things. And it's important because we know that individuals sort themselves into different schools, they sort themselves into different hospitals, and to some extent the schools also choose via mechanisms which pupils they admit, and the hospitals in some circumstance have choice over who they admit. And obviously the choice of those individuals, some of whom are much more easy or difficult to treat or educate, is going to affect our output measures. So we really have to take seriously, I think, individuals as inputs, which leads me on to think about, DFE. If you go and choose a school for your child, you are bombarded with league tables with millions of different measures of performance of these schools, one of which is a value-added measure, and that is trying to take into account the sort of skills with which kids enter a secondary school and how much that is built on during their time there. So I think if we're going to think about productivity, obviously we have to be super careful about how we measure outputs, but I think we also have to be super careful about how we think about the mix of inputs in these sectors. The last thing I want to say, I think, is what if we were being very micro and we started to think about what would be the ideal data set that we might possibly be able to get to think about these issues. And I started at the beginning by saying what's important is not just that these services perform well, but they reach everybody and they work well for everybody. So if we had, the ideal kind of Scandinavian data where we observed individuals throughout their whole lives with their identifier, we know every single time they go to the doctor, we know every single time they go to the hospital, we can see whether these services reach everyone and which groups of the population use which services, but we could also potentially track, repeated hospital interactions and things like that. Maybe this could be useful. We could also, if we knew wages, health outcomes, get to some of these things that Richard was talking about in terms of, what is the return to education, because we'd be able to get these people's employment records as well. My colleague Richard Davis, before I came here, said, have a look for 15 minutes on the eEstonia website, which seems to me the most digitally advanced sort of state provision that I've seen. This is the type of sort of thing I mean, whereby if we've got all this information, valuable information on individuals, we can link it all together. We might be able to think a little bit more about using that to really get to the bottom of some of the things I think Martin would like to include. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much indeed to the panel. It's an interesting set of reflections. I'm sure there's someone at ONS frantically looking up eEstonia to form the use case there. That's great. Okay. Well, look. Let me open for questions from the floor. We've got one hand up here on the right hand side. Other people, I'm sure, will be kind of formulating. There's another one lower down after that. Yes, please.
Yeah, we were talking about outputs and various ways in which we could measure them. What we didn't use is the expression outcomes. Now, I've seen quite a lot of discussion recently which talks about inputs, outputs, and then the next arrow goes along to outcomes. The nearest we seem to get to this was, I think it was Richard, but it might be Martin, who talked about investment in human capital, which sort of seemed to be an outcome at that point. But can you comment upon this somewhat enlarged discussion of outcomes? Because I have seen some discussions of it. I think Patrick Dunleavy is one of them, who tends completely to rubbish this third component. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's great. Can we take one more question? I think Joe has one down, just a little further down. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, a very interesting discussion and some very interesting points. And it's a subject very close to my heart, because actually Tony Atkinson's report, which was mentioned a couple of times, I led the little team that he had, which worked on that. And I really do feel that Tony added an enormous amount to this debate. What he did actually was to say there's two things here. There's some long-term principles which should be consistent across the, whether you're talking about the private sector, public sector, market sector, non-market sector. And in particular, one of those principles was that we were really trying to measure value and value added. And once you take that view, then you're driven to thinking that quality must be an important part of that. And Tony's example was actually broken bricks. That if the private sector had produced a load of broken bricks, said, here you are, here's some bricks, so we've got some output, haven't we? And then you say, well, actually, these are so low quality, they're of no value. That would obviously be silly to score that as output. So that's very quickly how he got onto quality must be included. And it also goes back to the point about how outcomes are involved here. Traditionally, the reason that national statisticians were concerned about outcomes being into the national accounts is that when you think, for example, about the health service, part of the rise in life expectancy and healthy life expectancy we've seen over 50 years or so, only a small part of that, so far as we know, was due to the health service. The other part was due to things like life practices, diet, better exercise, those kinds of things. But what you do want to get in is what is the contribution of the health service to that outcome, to that improved outcome. That's easier said than done, but it's really what the Holy Grail is in this area, and it gives the unified across the piece principle. The other thing you said, though, was actually the way in which services are delivered, I think this is Helen's point, changes all the time. And so he said it's very important that every 3 or 4 years, ONS goes back and looks again at about how these principles are being implemented. And I'm not sure that's happened quite as often as would have been desirable. It's probably now a good time to do that. The final thing I'll say is we talked about different ways of thinking about this problem. One that hasn't been discussed as much as it might be is thinking about an insurance approach. I mean, as it happened, my house didn't burn down yesterday. I didn't break my leg, and I didn't get appendicitis. But if I had, I would have known that there was a fire service available to help me. I would have known there's a hospital that would have treated my appendicitis if I'd got it, or my broken leg for that matter. So one thing which I think hasn't received nearly as much thought as it might be is there an insurance-based approach to this problem of public services which could be thought about? I haven't seen very much about that over the years, but it might be a growth area.
Super. Thank you very much. Really, really good questions. Okay, so let me see if I can parcel these out to unsuspecting panel members. So, Richard, maybe I can come to you to talk about outcomes versus outputs as per our first question. Paul, given that you mentioned different approaches to measurement, private, public, and there being some common elements here, I wondered whether you'd comment on those common principles and maybe on Joe's insurance question, if you feel able. And I wonder if I can come, Helen, to you. This is quite this is almost an identification question, isn't it? So these value-added scores of schools and the hospital. How would you go about addressing the question of quality from perhaps a micro perspective? We start with Richard and then Paul and then Helen.
Okay, so when I talk about quality adjustment, I talk about trying to capture outcomes data. I think there's a couple of key dimensions there which are worth thinking about because, as Martin's flagged, the devil's always going to be in the detail. Joe's completely right. How far we can attribute a change in a health outcome to my attendance at the doctor or the hospital as opposed to me giving up smoking or going to the gym more regularly. These are things that we need to make sure we think about. I think the mix of outcomes, very few public services deliver one singular outcome. And keeping in touch with the social expectations and the standards which society or the legislature set for those service deliveries, I think is really, really important. So 2 examples, where we implemented a quality adjustment for public order and safety, trying to decide whether cutting reoffending or maintaining safe or decent prisons was more important. In the end, we went back to Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons and the regime that was set for them and said, there's X number of targets of these, this number relate to reoffending, this number relate to safety and decency, and that's how we used some of that framework which sits around these to guide the weights that we put on the different outcomes. Similarly, in education, it's not just about value added. A few years ago, government introduced a duty on schools to reduce bullying. So we've always had an expectation that schools would reduce bullying and keep it under control. But now it's a legal requirement, and that's an outcome that they're expected to evidence and show to Ofsted. So we have looked to how we can bring bullying data into the basket of outcomes which people think about there, and completely agree with the point about keeping pace with change. And COVID is probably the really big stimulus here. It causes, the changes to delivery around particularly health education, also adult social care, also children's social care, really, really important issues there, do cause us to need to now stand back and think about what happens when the outcomes from a service that you're asking to deliver manifestly shift from elective care, surgeries, A&E, towards critical care, which is what we saw under COVID. And those weights and how we reflect those changes are equally as important. I'll pause there.
Two remarks. First one on outcomes. I think it was already mentioned that sort of the benchmark or the ideal is to measure the marginal contribution of the activity to the outcome, but that's only where a number of questions start, because the first question is, which outcome are we talking about? Okay, maybe your state of health, but then think of waiting services that may affect your mental health as well, your well-being more generally. I think there's a more basic question also, how far we actually want to go in the national accounts to capture welfare or well-being. And this is not confined to our measures of health education and the things we're talking about. I mean, it goes way beyond this and includes all other goods and services as well. And I don't think there's a definite answer to that. And it really depends on the questions that are being asked. My second point relates to the issue of service delivery. Indeed, that changes. And again, it's an issue of a new goods problem that we encounter all the time with digital stuff, new delivered and so on. And partially this is, I mean, the statisticians are not unarmed with this. There's a lot of experience in it. Partially it can already be covered by having a good and solid stratification of the services that are being delivered. I mean, this is pretty basic, but very important as well. And let me just add that we very often talk about quality adjustment and mentally confine this to an explicit act of quality adjustment, but actually having a well broken down system of accounting and stratification is an important and large, a good step towards quality adjustment that takes us far down. And actually, that's a big problem also in international comparisons. You have a different degree of breakdown between different countries. I mean, how do you assess how comparable the aggregate is that moves? Last point on this, if we talk about welfare or well-being measurement, right now we are weighting those elements, those lines in the stratification with cost shares. Well, I mean, if you think about well-being, we may want to weight that with, willingness to accept or to pay. So all these are a little bit of gray areas, and I don't think there's a definite answer, except that we should try and agree as much as possible on some pragmatic way of doing it.
Yes, I think I'm talking about value added. So I guess in an ideal world, you'd want to know something very detailed about the characteristics of the individuals who are going into those schools or into those hospitals to be treated, so you could run your regression control for them and see how your outcome measure was then affected by that. I think the measures that schools develop, they are useful, but they're far from perfect. Anyone who's looked at these school league tables will know that, some of the value-added measures can be negatively correlated with the measure of overall attainment, and that's because the way I think the DFE does it, it's based on exam grades which have an upper bound. So at some point you have a set of amazing kids going into a school, they simply can't get any better. So that school might have a very low value added measure. But I guess going back sort of more holistically, maybe there are things that we can use. So bullying was then mentioned. I know Ofsted reports are not popular at the moment, but these are exactly the type of things that these organisations are trying to measure. Equally, I think it's called the Care Quality Commission. exactly what they're trying to measure in terms of more holistic measures of the quality of healthcare providers or adult social care, for example. So perhaps trying to use some of those to get a more holistic measure of what these organisations are providing if you don't have sort of individual data.
Yeah, the ideal.
Could I pick up on
Yes,
the insurance issues, please? There are one issue with insurance, or the comparison with insurance. If someone claims on their insurance policy because their roof has blown off, you don't think that person has had a really high level of consumption this year, and that should be reflected in a measure of distribution. You think how unfortunate for them, they're having to spend money just to put themselves in a position that they always hoped they would be in. Similarly, if you look at, say, something like the health service, we know that health spending, apart from the very young, is directed mainly towards the older part of the population. And if we want to produce measures of well-being which reflect individual consumption, we need to move away from that to thinking of health as being provided on an insurance basis, so that the consumption of the insurance is the same for young people as for old people. They essentially, if the health service worked well, if the insurance system worked ideally, they would be the people who were claiming heavily on the health service would be restored to the health of the young people. We wouldn't want to say that their level of utility is higher than that of the young people simply because they're making greater use of the health service. The other aspect of insurance is that, as I understand things at the moment, if the price of an insurance policy increases because risk increases, say the accident rate on the roads goes up, that's treated as a price increase rather than a quantity increase. Now, you might think that if more insurance is being provided, that should be treated as a quantity increase. Similarly, if the health risks that people are exposed to changes, that may affect the way in which we would want to treat productivity if we apply the insurance principle.
Thank you, Martin. That's great. Okay, we've got a couple more questions. There's one down here in the front row, and there's one up in the gallery, and there's a third over here on the left-hand side. Can we get microphones to them? Maybe you can introduce yourselves. I should have said that before, sorry.
My name is Nishka Kenny. I work for Pro Bono Economics. I just wondered if you could comment on the feasibility of applying some of these measures to production in the non-government, non-profit sector.
Okay, thank you. That's a good question. If we come down, I think there was someone, yes, there.
Hi, I'm David Kaplan. I did some work on this in the ONS in the mid-1990s, so I go back rather a long time. I'm also a member of NSK's, the committee that Martin was talking about. I think one of the interesting things about the conversation we had in that meeting was about the need to ensure that we weren't seeking perfection and driving out the good. And it does seem to me there's been a lot of that in this debate. I think it's one of the reasons why the ESA has ended up where it is, because people have been seeking these perfect measures when actually none of them exist. And actually it is better to produce an approximation of a right answer than the zero, which we know is completely the wrong answer. I think that sort of drives the idea that what the threshold we should be talking about in this session title is output, measuring non-market output in the national accounts. And it's what's good enough for the national accounts. And I think that that's a different question to the one perhaps that Helen's asking, which is about how do low-level individual services and individual providers provide things. Now, there might be analogues, but we're talking about big, complex services with multi factors in terms of their outcomes. And there's in the UK, there's the Institute for Government who produce something called the Performance Tracker, which produces dashboards, I think, on the measures of public services, and these are far more complex than I think anything that could be put into the national accounts. And so there is a danger with these measures when people project them into saying, oh yeah, this means that output has fallen or productivity has fallen, when almost inevitably it's going to be based on a partial measure.
Okay, thank you, David. That's great. And down here at the front.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up the issue of open source software and the fact that right now we're in this amazing revolution of artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence had been, until very recently, increasingly dominated by very large firms. And over the last couple of months, what's happened is that there's been a democratization of ChatGPT level artificial intelligence, to the point where individuals all around the world are contributing to this. So this poses questions about what do we mean by production in terms of its location, and as well as in terms of the fact that corporations provide a lot of input into this open source software, but their ownership over the open source software is quite limited.
Okay, thank you very much. That's great. All right, so 3 quite challenging questions. Let me see who would like to take what. Richard, Richard or Paul, are you willing to speak to the question about non-market principles, applying those more broadly outside of the government sector? Perhaps Martin, you could comment on the good versus the perfect, and your kind of contributions and discussions at NSCASE, and what kind of indicators we might use. Who would like to talk about open source software and the attribution of that? You'll take that as well. Okay, Richard, maybe I'll begin with you, and then if we come to Martin and then to Paul.
Feasibility of thinking about the wider non-market sector. I think particularly here we need to distinguish between the HE sector and the charitable sector, third sector more generally. And there's good reasons for thinking that if we've got the principles right, we can apply them more widely. I think we need to do a bit more work in this area, and we've started that by initiating work with the ESCO, looking at creating a third sector satellite account, which is the natural place for us to wade through the sort of the detailed methods work and think about how that actually will behave. In terms of Leonard's question, this is really a challenge of boundaries that are defined by history, particularly a production boundary that takes a set of non-market free goods and puts them inside the boundary if they're delivered by government, and takes a set of zero price non-market goods delivered by other institutions and says these are outside the production boundary. And obviously, as digitalization has cantered forward, the challenge of that rather artificial divide, wherever you draw the boundaries, someone has to be in, someone has to be out. But when things which appear very, very similar in their nature end up bifurcated with some inside and some outside, this is obviously a challenging question. And I think it's really a question that leads us to thinking about the need for metrics which don't just think about the production boundary, but complement GDP and take us into a beyond GDP type debate, where we have different measures which try and reflect different boundaries, that reflect the different realities, the changing realities of modern economies.
Thank you. Martin, can I come to you?
Yes, so on the best and the good, I mean, as David Kaplan said, the NSCASE very much thought that one way of stimulating work on the issue of measuring productivity or measuring quality change in the public sector was to give it a more central role in the ONS products than it has at the moment. That one of the ways in which you do things better is by learning from what you do at the moment. And of course, although the ONS does publish public sector productivity figures with quality adjustments in place, if those become more important, more prominent, then the impetus to improvement will be greater. I think another consideration that we bore in mind was not Do we want to wait until it's the best possible way of doing it? That obviously will never come. But how do we think the proposed treatment in the public sector compares with what's done in quality terms in the private sector? Now, we didn't have detailed metrics of this, but I think I'd be rather surprised to learn that quality adjustments were perfectly measured in the private sector, and that set a standard which had to be met by the public sector before the same sorts of adjustments could be made. So, as David said, I mean, it's a point due to Keynes, why put in 0 when you know that the number can't be 0 in a table? Do the best you can, and 0 typically isn't the best you can. It was very much with that in mind that the committee made its recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. That's great. Paul, do you want to
maybe a comment on Leonard's point, which is again a bit more general, but applies to those services as well, about software, digital tools that are being used. I think, yes, we are really looking at activity and production that takes place in households. And, this is just something that we want to capture better. I'm not saying that this should be part of GDP necessarily, but I think we need to shed more light on what is going on there. And there is a lot of research ongoing in this field that can usefully be injected there.
Thank you, that's good. Helen, I don't know if you want to come back on any of those.
I mean, I guess it's interesting on the output and production side, but it's also on for me, it's an input into how these things are done. And so if we can think of surveys which aren't asking people what is the cost of your intermediate inputs, but what have you used, even if it's free, to produce this output, then that's the way to capture that flow of services that's going in that's unpaid for. I can't remember what else I was going to say, so shut up.
That's really good, thank you. Let me see, are there any other questions? There's one here at the front and then one in the middle. We've got 4 minutes. These are probably the last two.
Hi. I just thought, related to someone mentioned about thinking of households more generally and their productivity. I read Caroline Criado Perez's book, and she talked a lot about this, about particularly women's unpaid labour, like domestic unpaid labour, looking after children in the home, and what the cost would be to society if, for example, they had to pay for a childminder to do that instead. There is an economic cost to that, even if it's unpaid labour. I just wondered if you'd considered that in your, you're specifically here looking at, you mostly discuss government, but perhaps non-market could be interpreted broader than that. And also, could this be used as an argument, like if we, I'm not really clear how you're measuring this productivity. Is it like a quantitative measure? Like a lot of these are kind of subjective outcomes, and they could be quite long-term outcomes. For example, the benefit of educating a child you might not see for 20 or 30 years. I don't know how you would monetize a lot of these things. And yeah, also, lost my train of thought, but that was the main. I'll leave it there because someone else has another question.
That's great. Thank you very much. And there was one question in the middle here.
Martin Fleming. I think, as Richard knows, I've been doing a great deal of work for the BEA on software pricing. And of course, one can't think about software pricing these days without considering open source. As Richard pointed out, this is in early days, highly experimental still. And the satellite account is certainly a good place to think about this being located for the near future. There's two pieces of work going on in the BEA, and currently there are some reasonable estimates. My work has been on the software price index side as opposed to the volume. There are, for many types of open source software, there are private sector offerings as well as open source offerings. So there's an implied price. Now, it's not perfect in all cases, but it helps to be able to assign a value to get to a total. The second point I would make is Leonard may be concerned about double entry bookkeeping, because we could certainly estimate on the spending side, but then have a gap on the income side. Even though many contributors to open source software are doing it for their own personal benefit as opposed for compensation. But we have other categories of spending. There's certain types of financial services, the imputed value of home rental, and we make those assumptions on the income side to balance the two sides of the ledger. So while it's still early days, I would suggest it's not necessarily impossible to solve the problem, but I think where you start off is the right point. Even within the past 3 months, we've seen quite a bit of open source activity in the generative AI space, so it continues to be a quite pressing issue.
Thank you. That's good. All right. So a couple of toughish questions at the end here. Richard, seems to me some of these might be in your house. Perhaps I could come to you on the questions that we had here at the front to do with the household accounts, I guess, and childcare and labour costs. The software pricing, I don't know, Paul? Yeah. Okay. Richard, can I ask you?
So household production, very important, and we capture it in what's called the unpaid satellite account, which is really worth looking at. It's a vastly underutilised resource that we publish. Lindsay Brown and her team are going to be doing fresh estimates, bringing us up to 2020 into the COVID period in the next couple of months, I believe. Well worth looking forward to, which does give us a way of articulating, trying to capture work and output in that area. In terms of how we monetize some of the outcomes that we're thinking about, very much we are forced to grapple with many of the issues that you're outlining. So education, we look at education outcomes in terms of qualifications achieved, but we have actually over the last couple of years looked at how we apportion that back, because a child age 16 who takes his GCSEs, not 100% of the benefit created there was generated in that academic year. We have to apportion that back through their secondary and primary education, and working with education specialists to find appropriate weights to do that has been a key step in us quite substantially revising the data we publish in that area. So again, if you're interested, the Public Service Productivity publication will take you through that. Thank you. Good question.
Thank you. Paul, I don't know if you want to come up.
On the software, I think you're absolutely right, Martin. Looking at the private supply could give you a handle on the valuation of this. But again, I think we are truly talking here about household production, both on the supply side. I mean, households contribute to open source and they consume it. So, I mean, you'd really, conceptually, I think it's quite possible to fit that into a household production account. But of course, it takes us pretty far down into imputations of household activity. But it's perfectly reasonable to look at it that way.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much. We have run over by a couple of minutes, but that's been a really nice discussion. I think we can conclude feeling optimistic about this area of measurement. There's lots of exciting things coming. So thank you to the panel for their contributions today, and thank you for all your questions.